Hello and welcome to our fifth lecture on Introduction to Mechanobiology. So, over the last few lectures I have given you a broad introduction to this field and given several instances as to how forces are of relevance to biology and how dynamics of cells during processes like migration, division, and so on and so forth require forces and interactions between cells and their surroundings. I have also started by abstracting the cell as a tent. I started rationalizing what are some of the basic ingredients you would need in adherent cells in particular for the cells to have stable shape and interaction and proper function. Okay. So, in particular I started discussing about the extracellular matrix in the last lecture. Okay. And what we found was, so there is a in the examples I had discussed, I showed that there is a continuous dynamic crosstalk between cells and their extracellular matrix. So, it is not A affects B or B affects A, it is the combination of things. So, there are cells which secrete the extracellular matrix. So, primary among them is cells like fibroblast in the connective tissue which secrete lot of collagen. Similarly, smooth muscle cells and other epithelial cells. Okay. So, these are the cells which secrete the extracellular matrix. The ECM in return regulates the assembly of cells into functional tissues. So, it holds cells in particular positions and it integrates them into a functional tissue. And there are interactions between the cell and the extracellular matrix mediated via adhesions which regulate cell function. So, what this requires is for the cell to sense the physicochemical attributes provided by the ECM as distinct cues which cells must recognize and accordingly function based on that input. One of the particular ECMs that we discussed was the basement membrane, right. So, basement membrane is only 50 to 200 nanometers in thickness. It is there in almost all the tissues for separating adjacent tissues within an organ. It of course generates signals for cell survival, provides mechanical support to cells and also acts as a substrate for cell migration. Most importantly, most of the cells in normal physiology cannot breach the basement membrane. There are of course three exceptions to this, okay. One of which is for during the process of development. Okay. During the process of development, immune surveillance and diseases like cancer, okay, where cells actually degrade the basement membrane, and that represents the degradation of the basement membrane represents the first step in invasion, in initiating the invasion metastasis cascade. Okay. So, there are several extracellular matrix proteins and basement membrane in particular has multiple of them arranged together, but we discussed about collagen, which is the most abundant protein within our body and it provides tensile strength to the tissues. It is again produced by fibroblasts, smooth muscle cells and epithelial cells, and there are multiple types of human collagen. Okay. And what we also know is that fibrillar collagens form this triple helical structure where you have three chains which wrap around each other, giving you a banded pattern of periodicity 67 nanometers. Okay. So, now for collagen, let us say collagens in particular. So, individual fibrils will have one particular property, but when you make a network using these collagen fibers, you will generate a three-dimensional structure which has properties which are distinct than the properties of individual fibril collagens. Okay. So, understanding the mechanical properties of ECM networks like that of collagen is of key importance. Now, how do we go about doing this? Think of this, the spaghetti, uncooked spaghetti forms all these rigid rods, and I introduced the concept of persistence which has direct relevance to bending rigidity of those structures. But the same spaghetti when cooked, then what you have is this mishmash of these fibrils which are much more compliant and when they are held together, even if you do not put anything else, just together they provide some resistance. If you try to take out a single strand of it, you can feel the resistance that the network provides towards deformation of that one strand. So, the field of rheology in particular has been developed to understand how, or for probing how materials deform when subjected to forces. So, that of course brings to our first idea is, so you know what is a solid and what is a liquid. Okay. So, there must be something which is different in a solid and the liquid, but can we say an ECM network like a collagen gel is a solid or a liquid or something in between. So, in order to address that, we must first try to understand what distinguishes a solid from a liquid. So, if you take a simple thing, let us say in case of a solid, or if you take a spring, let us say spring is an example of a what we call as a linear elastic solid. Okay. So, what you have is when you compress a spring or stretch a spring, you observe instantaneous deformation, and till the force is being exerted, that deformation remains in place. But as soon as you remove the force, you see that the spring goes back to its original length or unstretched length. So, this is what we call a solid. Okay. So, when there is a deformation, there is a when you exert forces, there is a deformation of the solid, but when the force is removed, it regains its original configuration. Contrast that with a liquid. So, when you exert any force, it continues to deform for the duration the force is exerted. So, in case of so note the difference, in case of a solid you exert a force, there is an instantaneous displacement or deformation, and then that is constant. Okay. And once you remove, the solid regains its original configuration. Versus for a liquid, you exert the force, the liquid will flow, and it will continue to flow till the force is being exerted. Okay. So, what are the different types of deformation that we can subject either a solid or a liquid to? So, of course, taking the example of the spring, you can exert something, you can tense it, or you can, the element can be under tension, that means you stretch it. In contrast to it, you can compress it also. So, for a spring, for example, the resistance it provides in tension and in compression is the same. Okay. You can shear it. So, what do we mean by, so let me draw what is tension and what is compression, this is all very clear to you. So, you have a spring of certain length. Okay. So, let us say this end is fixed and you exert a force. So, what will happen? This spring will stretch to another configuration. Okay. So, this force is there, and you see that this length you will have an extension delta x is your stretch. You can have the similar case when it is compressed. Okay. So, compared to the original configuration, okay, this is your delta x. What is shear? Okay. So, imagine I take a block, okay, and I exert force in this direction. Okay. So, let me say this is x and this is y axis. I exert a force in the horizontal direction on the top surface. So, what you will have is a structure where the deformed configuration will look something like, okay. So, this is called as shear, okay. And you can have again this displacement at the top, which is delta x, and let us say this block is of height h. Okay. So, you define the shear as delta x by h, and you can have something like bending. So, if you take a long object, and you exert forces which tries to bend it, so this will have a configuration like this. So, this is an example of bending. Okay. And so, similarly you can have, this bending can happen as a consequence of compressive forces also. As an example, let us say you have a long prismatic beam which is anchored at one side, and you exert a force, a compressive force from the top. You can have a geometry where if you have slightly offset, this might be one configuration which this rod might have, or you can have a configuration like this as well. Okay. So, these are different bending configurations. Now, coming back, so when you exert these forces, so let us take the simplest case, okay, of tension or compression, okay, or let us say tension. Okay. If you take a beam of length L, let us say, and you exert a force F, let us assume that the cross sectional area of this beam is A. A is in meter square, has units of meter square, length has units of meters, force has units of newtons. Okay. So, how do you do? So, when you stretch it, it will again stretch by a certain distance. Let us say this extra length is delta. Okay. So, you have force. So, you define stress, normal stress sigma is given by F by A. Okay. So, it has units of Newton per meter square. Newton per meter square is called pascals. So, in short it is written as PA, capital P and a small a. Okay. So, unit of stress is pascals. Okay. So, for example, so when you have, so unit is pascal. So, whether it be tension or compression, your unit of stress is in pascals. Now, when you stretch it, so the percentage elongation, okay, the actual elongation epsilon is given by delta by the original length L, okay, and this is definition of strain. Okay. So, you have all heard of Hooke's law. Okay. And what does the law state? That when you stretch it, your stress is proportional to the strain. So, sigma is proportional to the strain epsilon, and you can write it as a proportionality constant which is given by E. This E is called the Young's modulus of elasticity. Okay. So, from here this expression, okay, you also know. So, sigma is given by F by A is E times delta by L. So, this expression can be modified to find out how much, given the Young's modulus of a material, if you exert a force F, if it has a length of L and a cross sectional area of A, how much will it stretch, and this will be given by F L by A times E. Okay. You have delta is P L by A E, F L by A E. Okay. Now, if you consider this Young's modulus E, right. So, if you can have two situations in which E is constant no matter how much force is exerted, or E continues to change. Okay. So, this is an example. So, if you so let us assume E is constant. So, then how will my stress versus strain curve look? So, if I plot stress versus strain, if E is constant, okay, if E is constant, then you will have a linear, a straight line. So, the slope being E. So, if a material is stiffer, then you can have the slope will increase. So, let us say if it is E and this is E prime and E prime is greater than E, then the slope of this line will increase. However, if you look at biomaterials or biopolymer networks, in many cases instead of this linear elasticity, so stress versus strain is straight line, that means E is constant, right. So, E is the slope of stress versus strain line. So, this corresponds to linear elasticity, but in red I have drawn this curve where your slope is not constant, slope keeps changing. Okay. So, this is an example of non-linear elasticity. Okay. This is an example of non-linear elasticity. So, we will quickly come and see how elasticity will change. Okay. So, for when you exert in shear, right. So, I wrote this equation sigma is equal to E times epsilon. If you have a material, okay, in which you are exerting shear, so you can define just like, so this is normal stress, you can define this as shear stress. Okay. So, for shear stress you can write down the equation sigma is equal to G gamma, where gamma is the shear strain. Okay. Epsilon is our axial strain. Okay. So, what you see, the equation is very similar. This is normal stress, axial strain, okay, shear stress, shear strain. So, there must be a relationship which connects E and G. Okay. So, for incompressible materials, so this is another aspect for incompressible materials. Okay. It can be shown that E is equal to 3 times G. Okay. This is because G and E are connected by the equation G is given by E by 2 into 1 plus nu, where nu is called the Poisson's ratio. And what is Poisson's ratio? Poisson's ratio is when you, for example, if you take this example, okay, you had gone from this length area A and length L to let us say area A prime and length L prime. Okay. So, Poisson's ratio is given by lateral strain by longitudinal strain. Okay. So, when you pull something along this axis, then it will get compressed in a perpendicular axis. Okay. So, Poisson's ratio is that Poisson's ratio is given by unit lateral compression by unit axial elongation. Okay. So, it can be shown that nu is equal to 0.5 if volume is constant. Okay. That is, material is incompressible. Okay. So, if you put nu is equal to half here, then you get back the equation E is equal to 3 times G is what I wrote in the earlier slide. Okay. So, this is for a solid. Now, think of a fluid. Okay. Let us assume, so we are thinking of a perfect fluid or an ideal fluid. Okay. For the case of an ideal fluid, let us assume you have a surface which is fixed, you have fluid on top of it, and you put a top surface, okay, which you pull. So, this is the top surface, this is a moving surface, which you pull at a speed of u. Okay. So, if this height is h, okay, let us say the top speed is u naught, it can be shown that for ideal fluids you will have a velocity profile. So, when you pull the top surface at a speed of u naught, the fluid particles of all the layers will keep on moving, and you will get a flow profile which is linearly increasing. Okay. So, your flow profile u at height of y will be given as simply as u naught into y by h. Okay. So, this is a flow profile. So, based on this you can have the simple law of viscosity. Okay. So, there is Newton's law of viscosity, which says that the shear stress is related to the gradient. Okay. It says that shear stress is related to shear rate via this constant of proportionality mu. Mu is called the viscosity. Okay. So, if you see, so this can also be written as mu into gamma dot. So, in contrast to the earlier case, in contrast to our shear, so for the solid we had this equation tau is equal to g times gamma. So, this is my shear strain. For a fluid, my shear stress is related to not the shear strain, but the shear strain rate, which is gamma dot, by the constant of proportionality, which is mu, or the viscosity. So, what units does mu have? So, tau has units of stress, so it should be pascals. Okay. So, I have tau is equal to mu times du by dy. Okay. Tau has units of pascals or Newton per meter square. Mu times u is meter per second and divided by meter. Okay. So, we have units of mu has to be Newton per meter square into second, okay, or this is called Pascal second. This is the units of viscosity. So, in CGS units, unit of mu is called poise. Okay. So, viscosity of water is 1 Cp. So, this is written as simple P. Okay. So, viscosity of water is 1 centipoise. Okay. So, this is what Newton's law of viscosity suggests. Okay. So, we have gone through the equation. Now, this brings us to the question. So, you have two extremes, an ideal solid and an ideal fluid. Okay. So, if you talk of ECM networks, okay, so where do they lie? Is an ECM network an ideal solid or is ECM network an ideal fluid? So, it depends on various things, including the type of protein, ECM density, extent of cross linking, okay, ECM organization. Okay. So, it is not just that it is uniquely determined depending on how you make your ECM network or hydrogel. You can have range of different properties. So, in essential, ECM network has some aspect of solid and some aspect of fluid, okay, and they are hence called. So, ECM networks are generally viscoelastic. Okay. ECM networks are inherently viscoelastic. Depending on how you prepare, you might have a solid or a fluid or some property of both. So, this is an example of how a stress strain curve would look for a collagen hydrogel that you fabricate. So, what you see, so these arrows indicate that at the time, so what you are doing is using let us say a stretching device, you take a gel, okay. So, you take a gel, this is your hydrogel, okay, and then you can stretch it back and forth, okay, and that is what is referred to as this cycle 1 and cycle 2. So, what you are doing is you are imposing the strain up to a certain point, letting it go, letting it relax to its original configuration, and again stretching it and letting it go. Okay. So, what you have are these cycles. So, what it shows you that the path the stress strain curve follows at that when you stretch it is different than the one it follows when you relax it. That is one of the points to be noted. The second point is that between cycle 1 and cycle 2 there is a big difference, suggesting that something has happened as a consequence of that one cycle of forcing, because of which the cycle 2 is different. So, if I were to approximate them as straight lines, okay, if so my curves are looking like this, okay. Okay. Even if I were to draw the slope of this, so the slope of this keeps changing, okay. The slope of this keeps changing from one cycle to the other, okay. So, suggesting that as you stretch the networking is getting softer and softer. So, if I take the slope, this slope is this slope is less than this slope, okay. So, the network gets is not getting softer, so it gets getting stiffer and stiffer, okay. So, with that I stop here for this lecture. So, to recap, what we have discussed is just a brief background of how to characterize properties of solids and fluids, and with that background we will now try to understand what are the aspects of a net ECM network which makes it behave like a solid or a fluid or something in between. Thank you for your attention.